Before making the base layer, let me first discuss the issue of seams. One is the hem of the sleeve. For this seam, you should leave a little extra, about 7 millimeters. And then there's the bottom edge of the front and back panels, and the neckline area of the front and back pieces. You should also leave about 7 millimeters for the seam, because we need to fold and sew the edges at these positions. If you leave too little, this area is difficult to fold. It's mainly for everyone's convenience in sewing. First, fold and sew the bottom edges of the two sleeves inward. Just fold inward along the seam line. Then top stitch on the front to secure it. This is how it looks after sewing. This fabric is quite dark. Then the thread I used is black. I don't know if everyone can see it clearly. Anyway, I stitched it at this position. It's about 4 to 5 millimeters from the edge. I have prepared 2 sleeves as a backup. Next, we take out the front and back pieces of the garment. Sew the 2 positions on the sides and the neckline toward the top. After both sides are sewn together, we make some notches on the seam allowance that we just stitched. Be careful not to cut into the stitching while making the notches. Next, we can attach the sleeves to the clothes. First, fold the sleeves in half. Find its center point. You'd better mark it with a pen. I made a small mark here. Make a shallow stitch. Avoid going too deep. It's safer to use a pen. Then unfold the front and back pieces. Sew the sleeve in this area of the armhole. The earlier stitch is meant to help us when sewing the sleeve halfway. The opening position and the bottom pointed seam are perfectly aligned. This way, the sleeves will be more standardized. It's not easy to make mistakes. Another thing to note is that we sew to the pointed seam. When sewing at the bottom, it should be spread apart to both sides. After measuring both sleeves, now we will work on the top neckline area. We need to fold the edge inward. Fold inward towards the back side. This is how it looks after measuring. The thread here is also quite dark. It's not very easy to see clearly. Actually, it's just like the bottom edge of the sleeve. Fold inward along the stitching to the back side. Measure a line on the front side to secure it. After finishing the collar, we need to turn it over to address the back opening, including the side seams of the sleeves and the body. I will demonstrate these 2 steps with different fabric, because the black fabric I'm using is simply too dark. I'm afraid that everyone might not understand. Next, we'll deal with the opening section at the back. As mentioned earlier, one side of the seam is 7, and the other is 14. Now, we'll stack these 2 back pieces with their right sides facing each other. Align this line at the bottom of the left sleeve hem. As long as this position is aligned, we will sew the top and bottom on the right side. It is aligned. Fold up from the bottom. Continue folding up to the end point. We have marked the end point on the drawing. After folding, we will flip it over. Let's verify the position of the stitches on the other side. You can see that I have folded it correctly above the stitching. Next, we will open up this section. The left side has a narrower 7 millimeters seam. We will press it down directly, then flip it to the front side. Fold a line upward along the edge to secure it. Once folded, it looks like this. The reverse side also looks like this. Next, we will work on the other side, so we will sew this wider part of 14 millimeters. At this position, we align and fold the initial sewing line in half. If completely folded, it looks like this, but we only need to fold it inward halfway. Turn it over after folding it. Fold a line here to secure it. It looks like this after folding. Take a look at the reverse side. At this moment, we are sewing 2 sides. One side has already been fixed. One side is still standing up a bit. We will sew the side that is standing up. That is, we will sew the wider side. At this point, flip it over to check the front. There will be a concealed button position on this side. Next, we are at the bottom of this front. This is the cutoff point we started with. Fold a line at a point slightly lower. Be careful when folding this line. The 2 lines below are stacked together for sewing. You only need to fold it just a tiny bit. Then we turn it over to the back. Trim this area where the sewing is done a bit. Only trim the part beneath the short line we just saw. We need to trim the seam on this wider side at the start. Here, we will trim the section we just folded inward. Trim off a bit of it. Take care while trimming. We must not cut off the initial suture line. You can take a look here. It is away from the initial suture line. There is still a distance of about 3 millimeters. The purpose of trimming this area is we will need to sew the hem thread later. If this isn't trimmed, when we sew later it will overlap. This area will be a bit puffy. Next step, we align the front and back pieces of the garment together. Here we are going to sew this sleeve side seam and the garment side seam. The other side is also sewn at this position. After sewing, check the underarm area on both sides. Be careful not to cut the thread, but it shouldn't be too shallow either. The underarm fastener is finished. We can turn the garment to the front now. This is the final step. I used the original fabric again. Here we need to fold the bottom edge of the lowest ring. Fold it inward and stitch it together. You can also fold it inward along the seam. This is how it looks after I've sewn it. It's hard to see because it's quite dark. Anyway, everyone knows there's stitching here. Then finally, everyone is at the hidden button location at the back. Sew the hidden button. This top is complete. Let's start with the collar part. This collar is irregular. It consists of 1 large piece and 1 small piece. We will follow the collar direction indicated on the blueprint. Draw the pattern directly on the back side of the fabric. The pattern I drew in the video is inverted. However, since I used the same fabric for both layers, so it doesn't matter that I drew it the wrong way. In the end, both the front and back can be used. If the fabric you are using has 2 layers, different fabrics, then you must pay attention to the orientation issue. Just place the collar's pattern upwards, meaning the side with the text should be facing up. Then draw the shape on the back of the fabric. This way, when we turn it to the front, the collar will be aligned with the direction of the finished product. When sewing here, we extend this position in the front and back by 5 millimeters. This is a position for stitching. When stitching here, we start from that 5 millimeters point going outward. We continue measuring the stitch to another 5 millimeters point going outward. The line with a smaller arc is not stitched. This is our reverse opening. We will flip it out from this point shortly. And the fabric I used for this collar. It's the same piece of fabric. Fold them face to face, just sew it directly. After sewing, let's trim it now. This one with the smaller curve. We leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. Cut the remaining areas directly with edge scissors. This part is not stitched. We use regular scissors along the edge. Leave a 5 millimeter allowance for sewing and trim it down. After trimming, turn both collars to the front. Iron it briefly. Iron it well for later use. Let's sew it together first. This pointed seam of the front and back pieces. The fabric here is facing each other. After sewing, the seam at the bottom should be split to both sides. Then we unfold the front and back pieces and turn it to the front side. Take out the pattern of the front piece. You can see the neckline position on the front piece pattern. There is a marking point here. Draw this marking point on the fabric. Make sure it aligns with the edge of this marking point. Start sewing to the left from the position of the marking point. Pay attention to the curvature of the collar here. The curvature of this collar is different from ours, so when we sew, we should do it like we do with the sleeves. Sew while following its curve. Let's take a look after it's sewn. The position of the stitching we just completed. It's probably about 1 millimeter to the right of the sewing line. This is a temporarily fixed thread, so it's best not to sew it exactly on the sewing line. That way, when we finish later, it can easily expose the thread. Then align this collar with the other piece. Align it with the collar position we just mentioned. Then sew towards the right side. This is how it looks when both collars are fully sewn together. Then we take out the front and back pieces of the ceremonial fabric. The reverse side of the fabric is facing up. The front side should align with the line we just marked. Sew about 1 millimeter to the left. This way, we will align with the original stitching line. The stitched collar will be neater. After finishing the sewing, we will make some notches at this sewing position. Make sure to make the notches correctly. If you don't make the notches before turning it to the front side, then the collar area will definitely be wrinkled. After making the notches, we will sew the sleeve area of the outer fabric and the lining together. Both sides of the sleeves need to be sewn together. Just sew along the seam line. When sewing, be mindful that there is a collar inside. Push the collar inward a bit. Then be careful not to sew over the collar while sewing. After sewing, we punch inspection holes at this position. Both sides need inspection holes. Then we insert the clamps from the front. Clamp a piece of fabric and pull it back. After pulling it closer, we use our hands, because the hemostatic forceps can sometimes pull too hard and ruin the fabric. The other side is pulled out using the same method. Once both pieces are pulled out, we flip it to the front side. Then we lightly press the edges. After pressing, it should look like this. Next, we pinch the front and back pieces of the fabric. Sew from this position at the lower hem of the fabric through the middle. Then sew it to the lower hem of the ceremonial fabric. Sew the 2 layers of fabric together. When sewing to the position on the ceremonial fabric, we need to leave a turning opening. Just leave one in the center, about 2 or 3 centimeters. Sew to the first point of the reverse opening and then stop. Then skip some distance. Continue sewing down at the second point. After sewing, we turn to the position where we first laid it out, the front side. Lift and sew the front and back pieces on the other side as well. Here we don't need to leave an opening when sewing. Since we already left an opening before, we only need to leave one side. So here we will directly unpick along the stitching. After unpicking, we will place the outer fabric and the lining fabric with their right sides facing each other. Sew down from the side seam next to the collar. Sew down to the lower hem. Then sew to the other side seam. The area next to the collar is where the opening at the back is located. It should be pulled slightly outward for better sewing. Everyone, please be a bit more patient. During the sewing process, all seams should be spread apart to both sides. Then we make diagonal cuts at the 4 corners. Top, bottom, left, and right. Be careful not to pick up the thread solution. After finishing the reverse seam, turn the garment to the right side. Tidy up and iron the edges and corners. After ironing, if the visible stitches look good, ladies, it's recommended to take out a visible stitch along this edge. This will make it smoother. This includes removing the visible stitches around the collar as well. Next, we'll create the bow decoration on the garment. Here I'll demonstrate how to tie a bow. Wrap a ribbon around your index and middle fingers once. Then go down and pull it out from above. Next, go through this hole in the middle. Arrange it according to the reverse side. Here I'm just showing how to tie a knot. The bag I'm using isn't this one. This green bow is what I plan to sew onto the clothes. The way to tie this bow is the same as what was demonstrated earlier. Then we can see the 2 tails that hang down from this bow. They will be a bit longer. Make sure not to leave them too short. Wait a moment. If it's too long, I can trim it. But if it's too short, you won't be able to add more. Then I've used a few beads here. This is a millet bead. First, position the bow where you think it fits best. Sew a few stitches by hand on the back to secure it. After securing it, take the long bag on the left, fold it over as shown in the video. Then sew a rice bead in the middle to secure it. Next, fold this bag in another direction. Sew a rice bead to secure it. Next is another long bag. Here, I'd like to make a suggestion. That is to say, if it's for the sisters who are selling. When we insert the needle, there is also the final stitch. This thread can be inserted from the reverse side, because I'm only making a sample garment here. And I'm a bit pressed for time. I just sewed it directly at the bottom. That is to say, if you turn it to the reverse side, this thread is visible. Everyone can decide according to the actual circumstances. If you want to make it a little more refined, it's definitely better to hide the thread ends whenever possible. At the start of the video, let me first discuss the issue of hat sizes. Take the example of a 6-point infant head. Each head may vary slightly in size. Additionally, there's the matter of the wig. When you put on this hat, then there must have been a wig before. The wig is a bit thicker, some are a bit thinner. This can also cause a difference when wearing the hat. The hats I have here are mainly made using my own doll's head. Add your own wig for dressing up. If the finished product feels a bit too big for everyone, or a bit too small, you can adjust according to the actual situation. Appropriately enlarge or reduce the drawings for production. Before making the hat, let me explain the pattern for the hat. Its blueprint is a circular ring like this. When we draw the diagram, first, draw the inner and outer circles of this ring. Then add seams to both sides. The other piece of fabric is to cut out this circle from the outer edge. That's it. There's no need to cut in the middle. It's the same, just add stitches yourself. The white one in front is ceremonial fabric. This red polka dot is the tablecloth fabric. The cutting methods for the tablecloth and gift fabric are the same. Each consists of one piece. First, let's measure the ring for the tablecloth and gift fabric. You can use a bamboo needle to secure the front sides together. Here we need to measure the middle circle of the seam. Just measure the seam completely around the stitching line. After measuring the seam, use pinking shears to make a cut on the stitching of the inner circle. If you don't have pinking shear, just use regular scissors to cut. After making the cuts, we scrape the seam in the middle with our nails. This step is to make it easier for us to flip it over later. Once we've scraped all the way around, we can flip it over. You can also use an iron to press the seam area to make it flatter. After ironing, measure a line 1 millimeter along the inner edge. After measuring the marked line, we take out this circle of the fabric. The front sides face each other and overlap with the previous part. Here we need to sew them together along the edge of this outer ring. To make sewing easier, we can turn it over to this side. When sewing, be careful to sew only the fabric to itself. Do not sew into this circular ring of the ceremonial fabric. Use a bamboo needle to secure it. While securing, we will take this upper layer of the ceremonial fabric. Use the tip of the bamboo needle to slightly fold it inward like this. This makes it easier to sew together. Once secured, sew directly along the edge with a stitching line. Once finished sewing, take out the bamboo needle. Then, make some notches along the edge. Be careful not to cut through the thread. After making the notches, turn it over to the side with the decorative fabric. Then stack the other piece of fabric with the right sides facing each other. This time, we will sew the edges of these two pieces of fabric together. When sewing, you need to leave a reverse fold. If it's a bit larger than a small fabric cap, we leave a 3 centimeter allowance. Then for something slightly smaller than a 6-part cap, we leave a 2 centimeter allowance. Anyway, everyone thinks it can be flipped. Then start sewing from one of the reverse points. Stitch around to the other reverse point. You can also use bamboo needles to secure it here. I just didn't use it on my side. This step is still about making the cutting button. But note that we won't make the cutting button at the reverse buckle position. Make it at other locations. After making the cutting button, flip the hat to the front from the reverse buckle. Just tidy up the hat a little, and it's done. If there are women who love home decorations you can also do some decorations you like on the hat. Next, we will make socks. The reason I didn't mention cutting to the sewing position at the beginning is that if your sewing position is on knitted fabric, fold it this way. It's not ideal to use a home machine when it's short here. Let's leave a bit more for now. We'll cut it after the task is done. To make the thread on our socks more secure, let's fold it down first. You can take a look. Please mark these points. That is, this point is on the other side, okay? This side is the front. Mark the points on the edge of the sock. This is the front. Then we draw a line on the back side. After marking, fold it along this line. The place where we put the stitch is right here. The place where we mark the points. We first backtrack 1 or 2 stitches to secure it. Then continue stitching forward until reaching this point. Then stitch 2 more forward. We also need to turn the needle back. Okay, we have now arrived at this new point. Then reverse 2 needles. Stop. Keep moving forward. Walk to this point. Then stop again. It's the same to rewind 1 or 2 frames back. Let's take a look first. Why do I need to rewind the needle at this point? When we cut it later, we'll follow this line. We cut a bit along the seam at this edge. Here, we have times when we use reverse stitching. Wearing and taking it off this way makes it a bit more secure. This thread won't come loose either. Now that we've finished pulling the thread, let's do some cutting. Just trim the excess stitching like this, flat. Do not cut this thread. It's fine to have 3 to 4 millimeters of this thread sticking out. If you cut it this short from the start, then when you go to pull it, This edge is not very easy to pull. Okay, now we fold it like this after cutting. These are all the backs. The areas with lines are all the backs. Besides saying that we made a few marks here, fold the digging tool along this edge line and pull the seam. After sewing, position about 3 to 4 millimeters outward from the edge. Cut the sock off. The areas with a larger curvature need to be cut with a notch. Be careful not to cut into the seams. Also, avoid cutting too deep. After cutting, turn the whole sock inside out. The sock is ready. Now let's take a look at this sock that has been shaped. This is what I ironed on the side edge. It's ironed directly here in this direction. And this is ironed on the front side. It's stitched on the back like this. And then it's ironed flat like this. Then about this sock. The area around the ankle is naturally narrower. If you like it a little wider, you can use the matching Christmas socks from our last issue.